because of differences of opinion. I remember back a few years back, Malaysia also have that differences where some of our scholars said the wukuf, we must follow the calendar, we must follow in Makkah. So, but anyhow, Alhamdulillah, now is our third class with our dear Professor Ahmad Shiozaki. Last week, our dear Prof explained the importance of the Silk Road, and then discussed at length two figures beside Cheng Ho, the Sultan Sulaiman and Yusuf Ma. So it's very interesting class. So without further ado, we invite again our dear brother, Associate Professor Dr. Ahmad Shiozaki, to continue with the third class. Dear Prof.
Thank you, Brother Shafran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And Eid Mubarak, dear brothers and sisters. I suppose today many of the Muslims, or majority of the, most of the Muslims celebrate Eid al-Adha and gather with families and relatives. And I hope you and people around you enjoy this Eid, celebrated Eid. But it is still the time of pandemic, and as you know, today or this week, the ibadah of Hajj was very limited in terms of the number of participants. And even in our local community, including Japan, China, Korea, many masjid could not have Salat of Eid. In Japan, the situation is not necessarily bad, but it's getting worse. And the Muslims need to be careful to prevent infection and to be careful to live as minorities. If we have the prayer of hundreds or thousands of Muslims, there can be cluster. There may be not, but we need to be careful as the minority. There may be voices. These Muslims do not care. The pandemic, they may spread corona. They are the spreaders. In India, there was a strange word, Corona Jihad. The Muslims conducting jihad by COVID-19 against non-Muslims. It sounds funny, but it is not a joke. Of course, we need to be careful, but especially as minorities, we need to be very careful. The majority people always watch us. And especially during the time of emergency, we need to be careful, actually. It is the position of the minority, either Muslims or non-Muslims. There were some clusters in Christian churches in Korea, in Japan, in many other countries. Then people say these foreigners spread corona. They conducted congregational prayer for their religions. They do not care what's happening in this society. The minority needs to be careful and understand what the majority people feel in the society. Today's topic is history. Last lecture, we discussed the history before the 20th century in East Asia. East Asia in this lecture mainly means China, Japan, and Korea. So I discuss mainly on the 20th century, the age of change in many aspects. And the Muslim community in East Asia also faced change. Or Japan and Korea encountered the Muslims almost at first time. Until the 1940s, most of the Japanese never met the Muslims, but they met Muslims in Malaya, Indonesia, or Philippines during the World War II. This picture is Hezbollah. Hezbollah in Indonesia. It's not Hezbollah in Lebanon or Iraq. Hezbollah in Indonesia. I will discuss on them later. Again, the words of Sun Tzu. A scholar of the war, who is famous of his book, The Art of War. He said, if you know your enemies and know yourself, you will not be put at risk even in 100 battles. The most important to win the war is knowledge. Knowledge on the enemy and also knowledge on yourself. Know yourself and know your enemy. Then you will win all the battles. It is his famous words. I do not mean China or Japan or Korea are enemies. What I am saying is, in the 20th century, knowledge became important. The 20th century was the age of the world, the great words, or world words. And knowledge or information or intelligence became so important. Of course, it was important even for the ancient people like Sun Tzu. But in the modern age, those who had knowledge became dominant. I mean, they colonized the world. I mean, the Europeans. I will discuss at first on the modernization in East Asia. Modernization happened in Europe, from the United Kingdom or France. Then they had power to colonize the other parts of the world. They had the science, technology, military power, industrial power, then colonized Africa, Central Asia, South America, and India, Southeast Asia. This wave of colonization came to East Asia in the 1840s. It was called Opium War, the war between China and the British. This is a very famous incident in the world history, but some of you are not so familiar, probably. This war was called Opium War because of the cause of the war. The British wanted to trade with China, but they had nothing to sell to China. China had everything. They could produce everything. No need to import food or clothes or pottery, crafts. Then the British started to sell opium. Opium is a drug from Iran, from Afghanistan. They brought opium from South Asia. Then the British sold opium to Chinese people. The Chinese government prohibited it. The British must not sell opium in China. As a result, the British declared war against China because Chinese government stopped their business. The British wanted to sell opium to the Chinese. The result of this war was the victory of the British. You see the Chinese battleships and the British battleships. British battleship, it's steam ships, had cannons, and the Chinese battleships had no effective weapons against the British battleships. China was defeated. After this war, the British took Hong Kong. Hong Kong became under the rule of the British after this war. And this war was very shocking for the East Asian people. The people in East Asia, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, believed China is the superpower. It was very shocking, even for the Japanese. The Japanese believed China is their teacher. Through the 2000 years, the Japanese imported knowledge from China. Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, even languages. The Chinese characters were imported from China. They never expected China can be defeated by the Europeans. But after this war, the French came, the Americans came, the Russians came, and they took territories from China. It was the Opium War. The impact of this Opium War was very huge. Japan changed the system fundamentally. It was called Meiji Restoration during the period of Japanese Emperor Meiji. Before the Meiji Restoration, Japanese foreign policy was very closed. I mean, they shut down foreign relationships with the outside, except China and Korea and the Netherlands. Because they believed the Europeans intended to colonize East Asia. Philippines were colonized already in the 17th century. The Japanese believed, especially that Christianity is the tool of colonization by the Europeans. At first, the Europeans spread Christianity. Then, they make their followers in the inside. These Christians, locals, will support the Europeans. Then Europeans colonize African countries, India, Asian countries. So what the Japanese did since the 16th century was the termination of all the Christians in Japan. There were around 2 million of Christians in the early 16th century, but they were terminated by the Japanese government. And Christianity was strictly prohibited. But after the Opium War, the Japanese recognized this policy cannot be sustained. The Europeans are stronger than China. So just shut down foreign relationship is not enough to prevent colonization. Japanese implemented European system, European laws, European education, European military system, European judiciary system, European industry system, European everything. And they took actions some decades earlier than Chinese and Koreans. After this modernization project, they started to conquer the area around Japan. The first Sino-Japanese War, the war between Japan and China. The Europeans defeated China, and they took territory and money, treasures, natural resources from China. So Japan can do the same and take territory, money, and resources. They thought it is the way to make Japan strong. Of course, this is very egoistic. And China does not of course, it's very deep rooted emotional issue until today. The Japanese imitated the Europeans and had wars against China. And this war resulted in the victory of Japanese. Japanese totally implemented the European systems. The Chinese, they imported weapons. They bought guns, cannons from the Europeans. But that's all. Just import weapons was not enough. Just to import weapons from Europe does not mean becoming the modern army. They had imported weapons, but it did not make Chinese modern army. And by this victory, the Japanese took money from China, national budget of China for some years. By that money, the Japanese prepared navy, the battleships, to fight against Russia. In 1904, there was the war between Japan and Russia. The result was the victory of Japan. After this war, Japan annexed Korea. Annexation, but actually Koreans say it's colonization by the Japanese. It is also a historical, deep-rooted issue between Japan and Korea. From the viewpoint of the Koreans, Japan imitated the Europeans, and they did the same. Japan colonized Korea. After this, Japan started the war against China again, Second Sino-Japanese War. They planned by conquering China, they can have more natural resources, and they can prepare the war against the United States of America. This plan was not completed because the World War II started in 1939, and Japan started the war against America, even though they still have large scale of war in China. This lecture is about the Muslim community in East Asia. I am talking on the modern history in East Asia very briefly. We do not have enough time, but I need to discuss on it because in 1868, there was Meiji Restoration in Japan. This policy means the Japanese government started to have foreign relationships with all the countries, not only with China. Even the Christianity was permitted. Without permission for the Christianity, Japan could not have foreign relationship with Europeans and Americans. As a result, the Muslims could enter Japan. Before Meiji Restoration, basically the foreigners could not come into Japan. Japanese policy changed from the shutting down to open and expansion. But even in the early 20th century, the Muslim community in Japan were very small. This masjid in Kobe was the first mosque established in Japan in 1935. The first mosque in the history of Japan. Kobe is a city of seaport. There were many merchants or traders. Among them, there were small numbers of Indian traders. Also, Indian Muslim traders. They established this mosque. Some years later, there was another mosque established in Tokyo. The mosque in Tokyo was established by the people from Central Asia. Central Asia. They were called Tatar people, but they were from Tatarstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Central Asia. They came to Japan as exiles or refugees. They exiled to Japan because of the Russian Revolution. Russian Revolution by the Communist Party, Soviet Union. These Muslims fought against Communist Party in Soviet Union, but they lost and they exiled to Japan. Hundreds of them came to Tokyo and established the first mosque in Japan. So the Muslims came to Japan, but they were small numbers. Maybe more than 1,000, but not more than 2,000. Just 1,000 and some hundreds. In the 1930s, the Muslims' presence was very small in Japan and of course in Korea. Korea was under the rule of Japan during this period until 1945. On the contrary, Muslims had presence in China more than 1,000 years. But in Japan, there were almost no Muslim community until the 20th century. In the 1930s, Japan had policy on Islam called Islamic policy by the Japanese government. This is a tool or tactics for the war. At first, it was for the war in China because there were Chinese minority. The Japanese army attempted to maneuver. They contacted Muslims in China and demanded collaboration with the Japanese operation, but they failed. Such Islamic policy or maneuver was conducted by the Europeans and Americans. Also, they studied, the British studied, the French studied about Islam and the Muslims so much for colonization. They studied on Islam and the Muslims because it was useful knowledge for colonization. Basically, this Japanese Islamic policy was such kind of tactics. Until this time, the Japanese government was not interested in Islam at all. But in the 1930s, there was war in China, and 1941, they started the war in Pacific and Southeast Asia. They did not expect they will have battles in Southeast Asia. But suddenly they needed research on Southeast Asia. There were no specialists on Indonesia or Malaya or Burma, but suddenly they started to study. Then the priority of this Islamic policy became study on Indonesia. Because during the World War II, they occupied Indonesia until 1945. And they supposed they can utilize or they can find collaborators among the Muslims in Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia and Malaya. These were such projects in Indonesia. This is written, Kiai Koshukai, Kiai training course. Kiai in Indonesian language. Mudir or Mudir, the head of pesantren or madrasa, Islamic school. So the Japanese army contacted Kiai or madrasa teachers, especially the organization Nahdlatul Ulama. They organized a training course and they have support or provided many assistance to get collaboration. One of the achievement is this Hezbollah. Hezbollah, it was a name of armed group of Indonesian Muslims. They are not Japanese soldiers. They are Indonesian Muslims, mainly from Nahdlatul Ulama. They are ustads and murid from madrasas of Nahdlatul Ulama. A Japanese army gave them weapons and trained as soldiers because they expected if American army will come to Indonesia, they need support from the locals. So they trained these madrasa teachers and students to fight against American army. But Americans did not come to Indonesia. Americans directly went to Japan and did not need to come to Indonesia. They directly come to Japan and occupied Japan in 1945. It was the Japanese policy on Muslims during the World War II. But after the war, the Japanese lost interest on the Muslims. In China, the Communist Party took the government. The People's Republic of China was established in 1949. In 1966, there was so-called cultural revolution. It was the hardest time for the Muslims in East Asia in the 20th century. This picture is Muslims surrounded by Communist Party supporters, and the Muslims were forced to eat pork to cut all the relationship with Islam. Such period continued almost 10 years. But in 1978, China changed. Reform and opening up. The economic development period started in the 1980s. In 1989, the Chinese GDP, gross domestic products, were still smaller than United Kingdom. And Japanese GDP was more than 4 times of the China. But 20 years later, Chinese GDP became bigger than Japan, even double of the United Kingdom. 7 years later, now it's almost double of Japan. So China had great potential, but they could not start economic development until 1980s. during this economic development period, the situation of the Muslim community was not so bad, even in China. In Japan, the Muslim population increased since the 1980s, and especially last 10 years, since 2010, the foreign population in Japan increased rapidly. Especially China and Vietnam, Philippines, they are the majority. But the Muslim population also increased during the last 20 years. They come as mainly workers and students. What's happening now in Japan is not so different from Europe or North America. The Muslims are foreigners. They come as workers or students. Many of them go back to their countries, but a part of them stay in Japan. Today, South Korea and China also became prosperous enough. South Korea and Taiwan also accept thousands, hundreds of thousands of foreign Muslims, mainly from Indonesia and some other countries. They are also workers and students. China is now attracting Africans, including the Muslims from Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, other countries. The Guangzhou, a city in southeast China, it was one of the city of the oldest Muslim communities in China. Now there are bigger numbers of Africans, and there are also many Muslims. Thousands of African Muslims stay in this Guangzhou and other cities in China. The Muslim demography in East Asia is changing rapidly, mainly because of the foreigners. And it is changing now, and we do not know exactly what will happen 10 years later or 50 years later. The Muslim population may increase like Europe or America. There may be troubles, conflicts, or there may be development of the Muslim communities in Japan, Korea, and China. But we do not know exactly as like we do not know the future of the Muslim communities in Canada or America or France. They are developing, but of course, it's not so simple, not so easy. There must be many things to be discussed. We need to be careful and we need even academic research on the development of the Muslim communities in East Asia. It is not simple. We need to know many things. We need to understand the local or host society, its culture, its religions, its law systems, people, even the worldview. I will discuss on such issues. How can the Muslims survive and develop their communities in East Asia? From the next class, next lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. You spent, I think, the background, the Meiji Restoration, the Opium War is very important. You said that taxes from China were the main source of funding for Japan development militarily. Can you explain more about that? I mean, all when they occupied China, so they got all the money from China. What that does it mean?
It's to say simply, it's a condition of peace agreement.
Okay.
Japan will stop the war, but China has to pay this amount of money every year. Such agreement was concluded after the war between Japan and China.
Oh, okay. So this is a part of the payment.
Compensation.
Compensation, yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay, we take one question from Brother Nuruddin. Prof, can you explain how the Kobe Mosque was used as a refuge during an Allied attack? Before the Great Asian War, World War II, some Muslims used Japan as a role model for modernization without becoming Western. Please explain, is Japan really not westernized before World War II? What about the development of Chinese Marxism, especially in the post-Mao Zedong era?
Well,
does this Marxism give more space to Islam?
I think there are some questions and they are big issues. And I suppose it takes more than 7 weeks to discuss, but I tried to answer briefly. Kobe Mosque during the World War II. Yes, Kobe Mosque used as a refuge. There were many bombings during the World War II. I mean, by the airplanes, American Air Force, all over Japan, not only Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in Tokyo, more than 300,000 or more people were killed because it was repeatedly. The American bombings were repeatedly, almost every day, all over Japan during the 1944 and 1945. But fortunately, Kobe Mosque was safe. It was not destroyed. Therefore, it became a shelter for the refugees. The reason was simple, because most of the buildings were destroyed. But luckily, Kobe Mosque was safe. So it provided shelters for the neighbors in the city. Japan really not westernized. What is the westernization? This is also a big issue. And among the Japanese, there were many controversies, many discussions. We cannot shut down the relationship with the Europeans and Americans. We need to import knowledge from them. But what do we do? Such discussions continued from the 1850s, 60s, 70s, even the 20th century. Some said we need only technology. The others said we need knowledge, science, all kinds of science, not only natural science, but also social science, human sciences. The others said, it's not enough. We should change language. We should teach English in the school. English should be official language because it is more civilizational language. And it is a superior way to develop the civilization. The others said, we need Christianity. Christianity must be the basis of the European civilization. Without Christianity, we cannot establish the real strong civilization. So there were big controversies for decades. The conclusion was the majority of the conclusion was we need technology, we need science, we need knowledge, including social sciences, but we should not use English, just to translate.
Sure.
Christianity is not necessary. It was the mainstream, but it's up to the interpretation. There may be a certain amount of westernization, but without Christianity and without English as official language. But of course, some can say Japan is westernized because they imported many things. Development of Chinese Marxism, big topic.
You can answer later on if you in next class.
And relation, Chinese, even, it is still controversial, even among the Chinese. I mean, there are many interpretations among the Chinese also. And Islam. My individual opinion is they do not change so much. I mean, Chinese are Chinese. And I mean, their Chinese civilization. Marxism is not so big element in their society, even today. Chinese civilization has history of more than 3,000 history, and substantially they do not change so much. I mean, I do not mean it's bad, but they have their continuous civilizational elements until today.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think there will be more bigger question next classes when come to the society, when come to lifestyle, especially now in terms of this open access online, that people can become Muslim without meeting any Muslim, which is common nowadays, inshallah. Thank you so much, Prof. We'll see you next week, same time, same day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.